Okay, and welcome back. So today we're going to take a bit of a break. Up until this point, we've been talking about this explosion of modern styles that happened right before World War I. And so now we're going to go back and we're going to talk about the decorative arts, because there had been this huge transformation in both the decorative arts and architecture in the 19th century. This is always a very difficult topic to talk about. For one, what does it mean to be decorative arts? Generally, there's no real clear definition of what defines a decorative art other than, fine art, other than fine art is meant to stand on its own, and decorative art is meant to support something else, like architecture, textiles, furnishings, utilitarian objects, cabinetry, all those kind of things. And so it's kind of a difficult topic to work with. And so it really is its own separate topic, so we'll be developing it here. We're going to be talking about this period from the 19th century all the way up into the 20th century, and then we'll stop there, then we'll come back next lecture and talk about what happens to the arts, the visual arts, in the wake of World War I. So let's go ahead and get started. One of the first things you have to know about the 19th century is it changed everything. We have this huge explosion in population, in prosperity, in standards of living, but we also have this tremendous social change that goes on. One of those things that changed is just how we made stuff. For most of the history of mankind, most of the things that we had, our houses, our textiles, our furnishings, were all made by hand. They were made by hand by craftsmen. And even though there were some pretty big workshops and some pretty organized guilds, it's still pretty much one object at a time made by skilled craftsmen. But that changes entirely beginning in the 18th century and accelerating into the 19th century because of mass production and, you guessed it, the Industrial Revolution. Boy, we keep coming back to this, don't we? And so what we see is an era of mass production, where an individual isn't responsible for making a chair or a table, they're responsible for making a part of a chair or a table. We have assembly lines, we have people who are alienated and distanced from the production of their own labor, and they just become kind of workers in a factory. This is something that gave way to many of Marx's theories about the alienation of labor and the exploitation of labor. On the other side of it, it meant that there was a lot more stuff to have, that your average ordinary person could have a lot more physical materials, wealth, mass-produced objects, because of industrialization. Before the 18th century, if you had 2 or 3 changes of clothes, you were pretty fortunate. Most people only had 2 or 3 changes of clothes. Now you open up anybody's closet and they practically have, more jeans than that, and half a dozen pairs of shoes. That wasn't the truth going back into the 19th century. So having multiple changes of clothes is a product of cheap production of textiles. Textiles was one of the first things to be industrialized, but it soon started affecting everything. Furnishings, houses, all kinds of new and modern materials were produced. And let's be honest, the quality wasn't all that great. Mass-produced stuff tended to be very, very low quality. We think of mass-produced as being low quality today. Oh boy, you have no idea how bad the quality was of some of this stuff being produced. But hey, it's better to have something than nothing. And there's kind of an interesting dynamic here. I don't want to get really long into this, but the truth is, if you're making everything by hand, there's really no incentive to make it poor quality, because it takes you so long to make the object, you might as well invest that extra level of craftsmanship to make it good, and you can withdraw value on the opposite end. If you make a cheap, crappy chair, it still takes you, a dozen hours to make that cheap, crappy chair. And so might as well spend the extra 6 hours making a really good chair and sell it for that much more. You're so invested in the time, you really have to continue to do that. That's why handmade things are naturally more crafted, because there's an incentive. The economic incentive is there to extract as much value as possible. But everything changes when it becomes mass-produced. When something becomes mass-produced, then you really can make a chair. It doesn't take 12 hours to make a chair by hand. You can make a chair in an hour. And so all those incentives to add the extra details or craftsmanship, that just goes away. And you're like, let's just make it cheap. and let's produce as many as we can. And now you know why everything in IKEA is made out of particle board, because it's just more affordable. Mass production means incentives are going to be to get it out there as fast as you can and to lower the prices as much as you possibly can. So mass production changes everything, and people react to this. One of the ways that they reacted to this is there was a sense of things being chintzy, of cheap. And so furniture makers, designers wanted to respond in kind. But a lot of the responses were really kind of rehashes. And the 19th century is noted for a lot of revivals. There were Egyptian revivals, there was Renaissance revivals, there was Romanesque revivals, there was Gothic revivals. There were revivals in every single style you could imagine. And what's interesting is some of the mass-produced goods traded in this, because a lot of these styles were seen as upscale and being valuable. But also high-end, upscale producers were doing this because they just wanted to differentiate themselves. There were more revivals in the 19th century than you can shake a stick at. It's really kind of astonishing. And some of them were quite ridiculous. For example, there were even revivals of non-Western styles. This was a style that was called Hindu, but it was actually not Hindu at all. It was actually Indo-Persian, what we might regard as kind of Indian or Muslim style. This was done for the Regency period. This was done for not King George III, for Prince George III's pleasure palace, and the interior was done in a kind of ridiculous pseudo-Chinese style. And so a lot of this was seen as just fake. A lot of this kind of decoration, we were either rehashing the past or we were, creating just pastiche fantasies out of other culture styles. And there was a revolt against this kind of sentimentality and revivalism. And it started with this guy, William Morris. William Morris was a textile designer, and he was one of the people who founded the Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society, which gives the name to the movement, which is the Arts and Crafts movement. Here was one of their annual catalogs that was actually exhibiting the things that they were showing off. Now, as I mentioned, William Morris was a textile designer, and what he wanted to do was to bring a kind of richness and at the same time simplicity and authenticity back into materials. He wanted things to have a sense of design. Fascinating thing about the concept of design, we live in a world of design. And I know that, well, don't tell any of the graphic design professors at UVU. Shh, this is just between you and me. But design goes through a fascinating transformation in the 19th century. In fact, the 19th century is where the concept of the designer is first invented. If you go back to dictionaries at the beginning of the 19th century and you look under the word designer, the chief definition of that will be schemer, plotter, planner, and it usually means somebody in a political and a Machiavellian sense. That's what a designer means, and it's not a positive thing. But if you go to dictionaries by the end of the 19th century, it means what we mean a designer to be: somebody who organizes, designs textiles, patterns, interiors, things like that, and become a very positive thing. How did that word change in meaning? And it changed largely because of the Industrial Revolution, if you think about it logically. That is, if you wanted someone to design clothes for you in the 18th century, you didn't go to a fashion designer. They didn't exist. You went to a seamstress or a haberdasher, somebody who was, good or gifted with clothes, a tailor. If you wanted somebody to design something in terms of graphic design, you would go to a printer or a printmaker or an engraver. These were all specialized craftsman positions. But by the end of the 19th century, all these craftsman positions had been taken over by mass-produced means. And so it's the economy of scale. What I mean by that is that when you start moving to mass production, you have a bunch of little workers, but none of them are craftsmen making really intricate things on the bottom level. They're just doing one little simple repetitive mass-produced task. So if you want them to be coordinated, you need them to be planned, you have to have a designer at the top. And so this top-down vision of a designer who designed things like textiles or furniture, etc., all of those things. Again, in the 18th century, if you wanted a chair, you didn't go to a furniture designer, you went to a cabinet maker, etc. But that changes because of the economies of scale. We live in the golden age of design, but design is really a byproduct of the Industrial Revolution. Because now these things are being made by factories, you need somebody at the top to plan it all out. And William Morris was one of the first to say, we need better designers. We need people who are making plans to make things for people that are A, actually aesthetic and attractive, and B, functional and worth the value. And so he actually is the inventor of the very famous Morris chair. The Morris chair was one of the very first simple armchairs. Again, here decorated in his classically designed fabrics. He was looking for simplicity, authenticity. He took inspiration from medieval houses, and he himself was an architect and designed houses. These houses looked like medieval or Tudor houses, and they had very simple, almost neo-Gothic interiors that were dressed down. These were things that could be made simply and authentically, and they elevated the quality of the material. So, things were made out of solid wood. Now everything is particle board. Now solid wood is, an expensive thing. But he wanted these things to demonstrate the quality of the materials. This had an enormous impact on American designers. Probably the most important is Gustav Stickley. And Stickley introduced a whole series of furniture designs that we call craftsmen. Craftsman design was the American response to the arts and crafts movement of England, an attempt to get back to simpler, more authentic things. What I love about a craftsman chair is that all the joinery is present. A craftsman chair doesn't hide things. You can see the pins and the joints of the things of how it's fitted together. It's an honest use of materials. And you can see this reflected in architecture. The most famous is the Gamble House. Okay, pop culture aficionados, where do you recognize this house from? That's right. This was used as the Brown house in Back to the Future. So this is the house that Christopher Lloyd and Michael J. Fox hang out in. It's actually in Pasadena. But when you look at this, you can see the same things. It uses the wood to great quality. It has rustic tile work, handmade tiles, beautiful joinery. And you can see the joinery. You can see all of the wooden pins and things put together. So this is a kind of retort to the era of mass production. A way of getting things that are honest and authentic, but are not revivalist or a rehash. Just think of styles of the 19th century, the way that movie remakes and reboots are today. We are in an absolute creative doldrums in terms of creativity. Everything is a franchise. Everything is a reboot. Everything is a remake. Just imagine being a designer or an artist or a craftsperson or somebody in the 19th century, and everything is a rehash, everything is a reboot, and you're like, ah. And so you can understand why people gravitated to this, because it was more authentic. There's also some innovation going on. There's also people saying, let's just try something new. And one of my favorite styles to come out of this period is Art Nouveau. Art Nouveau has a variety of different names depending on where you are. But it was a whole collection of styles that emerged in Europe towards the end of the 19th century. That is, okay, we don't want revivalism, but maybe this dressed down craftsman or arts and crafts style is a little too simple. We want something ornate. We want something organic. We want something beautiful. And so the designers, again, broke from the revivalist past, but looked for something that was really ornate. And the new materials that were being created at the time made it very easy for them. One of the things that is noted in Art Nouveau is it takes its inspiration from some odd sources. They liked things like seashells or insects, things that had intricate beauty but were still organic, and you can see that organic style come across. Hector Guimard's, subway stations are just incredible. Victor Horta redesigned his whole house in this style. And again, you can see the use of new materials. These pillars and supports and the railings are all made out of wrought iron. Great thing about iron is you can heat it up, you can bend it, you can curve it, you can make it to any shape. You can see how the roofs are made out of glass. Glass was, again, a new material. And so you could make these organic surfaces. Perhaps the most famous of these architects would have been Gaudi. Gaudi designed the Casa Batlló, in this case, this apartment complex, but he was using reinforced concrete. The great thing about concrete is you can make it in any shape you want. So he made it into these organic, beautiful shapes with twists and forms and stained glass. We finally had the ability to make curves and columns in just about any shape we wanted, and everybody decided, hey, let's exploit this to the max. You see this also in printmaking. Alphonse Mucha's wonderful prints, which have been copied endlessly and everywhere else. America also had its contribution to this as well. Louis Comfort Tiffany. We now know Tiffany as a jeweler, but at the time he worked predominantly in stained glass and interior design, and these wonderful lamps and organic forms that he created came out of this style. His very famous dragonfly lamp and etc. Again, looking for odd sources. And a part of this was a movement we call the Vienna Secession. The Vienna Secession was a group of artists who in 1897 broke away again from the formal art community in the academy and wanted to create something different. Here is this hall. This is the Vienna Secession building, and in this you see this beautiful golden dome. Here you can see in the detail that it's made up of leaves. The decoration of it is just ornate. You probably know the Vienna Secession movement because of Klimt. Klimt's famous work, The Kiss. If you look at this, yes, it's a painting, but it's very much a decorative surface. It's flat and gold. It's like mosaic and tile and stained glass work together. It brings those decorative elements into the form. There's also some wonderful experimentation with furniture, creating things that were new. This is Hofmann's very famous Cubist Armchair that was created at the same time. So there were lots of different movements trying to push away from this endless revivalism, these reboots and remakes of the 19th century, and to move into something a little bit more authentic. What's interesting about Art Nouveau is that it has a very short lifespan. By 1910, people are saying it's just overwrought. They wanted something simpler. Something more authentic. Art Nouveau has such diversity of style, and quite frankly, it dies out very quickly. Most of the Art Nouveau buildings get destroyed very quickly, and it's not until the 1960s, the psychedelic 60s and 70s, where we have this appreciation for the past. We start getting historical preservation laws that people look back at these Art Nouveau buildings and say, hey, wait, just a minute. Those things were kind of cool. And now Art Nouveau, it's funny, I think Art Nouveau is probably more popular now than it's ever been. I mean, honestly, and of course, Art Nouveau continues to influence things. I can't tell you how many posters I've seen done in Mucha's style where we have but instead it's going to be the Disney princesses or characters from Star Wars. Same thing with Art Nouveau. If you've ever seen, of course, Lord of the Rings, you have Rivendell. Rivendell is done in an Art Nouveau style. It's really kind of interesting. Somehow we decided that elves are Art Nouveau and dwarves are Art Deco. But anyhow, so there was this attempt to push and create new styles. But ultimately, all of these things are, again, synthetic. They are, kind of creations of trying to answer the problem of revivalism. What really changes modern art and modern architecture is the introduction of just really, truly new ideas and the capacity of new materials. And to talk about that, we've got to go to what many people regard as the first truly modern building, and that's Joseph Paxton's The Crystal Palace. Joseph Paxton is a fascinating character. He's not an architect. He's actually, quite frankly, he's a gardener. He's a guy who built greenhouses. He had gained a reputation for building greenhouses. Remember, this is long before the mass production and shipping of food in refrigerated cars, which is the kind of stuff we take for granted. You can go to any grocery store and get a mango and a papaya today. That was not possible. If you wanted fruit and you wanted it out of season, your only choice was to grow it yourself. And if you're going to grow tropical fruit in England, you need a greenhouse because England just ain't that warm. As a matter of fact, the banana as we know it, people, when they look at bananas, there are literally hundreds of varieties of bananas in the world. We recognize that with apples, but in America, when we say bananas, we generally mean what is called the Cavendish banana. And the Cavendish banana was a banana that was raised and bred in a hothouse in England. And it's now become the most popular banana. It's a dessert banana. Bananas have so much diversity. There are red bananas, there's plantains, there's all kinds of bananas. Some bananas are spicy, some are savory. They're really kind of cool. But in America, when we say banana, we mean these sweet yellow bananas, which is a Cavendish banana. And believe it or not, that thing was bred and made in a hothouse in England. Crazy, crazy, I know. So that's what Paxton was famous for, was for making these greenhouses. Now, he came along at a time when the technology really made this possible for the first time. Two materials: one, cast iron, the ability to make large structural elements in single pieces of cast iron, and the second was plate glass. Most glass up until the 19th century was again made by hand. All those beautiful stained glass windows that you see in Gothic cathedrals, every single one of those pieces of glass started out as either a blown vessel or a cylinder that would then be unfolded and allowed to lay out flat. And you couldn't make a piece of glass bigger than about 2 by 2 feet. It was just impossible. But beginning in the early 19th century, modern technology made it possible to make large sheets of glass, at times 8 and 10 and 12 feet long. And that's the first time that had ever happened. And the glass was really, truly clear. I don't know if you've ever seen old glass, but old glass is full of bubbles. It has streaks. It has ripples. It has a texture to it, like the kind of glass you see on a shower stall, except now we do it intentionally. But back then, they couldn't do it. But this time, they would pass the glass while it was still hot under rollers that would cool it and smooth it, so you could have genuinely transparent glass that was clear, that you could look through and see something on the other side without seeing any ripples or distortion. This is kind of a miracle. So England, this is the period of English Empire, and England decides to have what would become the first World Exhibition. They wanted a massive exhibition to show off England's industrial and military might, and of course the spread of all its colonies. And so they decided in Hyde Park to erect a massive exhibition hall. And Paxton submitted a proposal. They had a competition for who was going to design this hall, and he submitted a proposal. And his proposal was to make a giant greenhouse, a palace, a crystal palace made entirely out of glass. And the thing was one of the first demonstrations of prefab architecture. All of the trusses, the columns, the posts, everything were cast in iron and brought to the site and assembled. They assembled it over the top of the park. Living trees were actually encased in this, and then all of the area was filled in with panes of glass. And it became a massive exhibition hall. It was opened by Queen Victoria, and it was an enormous success. There were steam engines and drilling machines. There were works of art. There was some of the first displays of non-Western art from all of the various imperial colonies of England, from India and elsewhere, and Oceania, and they were brought there so that you could see them. And the building, its structure, was just remarkable. People really were stunned by it. It was the first time that a building had ever been constructed like this so quickly. They built it in less than a year. This massive structure contained an entire park practically, and they could build it in less than a year. It was so loved, they decided to take it down entirely and re-erect it in London. And so the whole thing could be taken down piece by piece and then put back up. And he built it originally in less than 8 months. And over the time period that it was up for about 1.5 years. It accommodated almost 6 million visitors. And they came not just for the amazing wonders of modern technology contained inside, but for the building itself. Alas, you can't go and see it. It's gone. It was actually burned down. There was enough flammable material in it. It was destroyed in 1936. But it forever changed the world. It showed that you could build a building without mostly any of the traditional materials that we thought of. Brick, wood, all of those things you didn't need. You could build a building entirely out of glass and steel. And this thing is ultimately the grandfather or great-grandfather to all of the great modern skyscrapers, steel and glass skyscrapers today. There was another great engineer at the time who also expanded this, and that would be Gustav Eiffel. Gustav Eiffel of Eiffel Tower fame. He was, again, not an architect. He was a civil engineer. It's kind of fascinating that all of these first advances in modern architecture were made not by traditional architects, but by people outside the field of architecture, by greenhouse designers and by civil engineers. He too was really working with structural steel and with cast iron and was producing bridges like this. The success of the 1851 exhibition, World Exposition in London, was so popular that every country said, well, I'm going to get on that. I'm going to show why our country is the best. And so everybody started putting on world fairs and world expositions as well. Massive displays of their industry, their wealth, their power, etc. And they would invite other nations to come. France had many of them in the 19th century. And in the 1888 exposition, they decided that they wanted to put up a lighthouse, something that would show off modern electrical light. And Gustav Eiffel, submitted again a proposal for a competition, and he got the nod. And because, again, it's made out of structural steel, it went up incredibly quickly. This became the Eiffel Tower that we know today. Now, it, much like the Crystal Palace, was intended to be a temporary structure. It was intended to go up and then come down. But it went up, and it's funny because the critics really didn't like it. They thought it was rather gaudy, and many people didn't like it, and it nearly got taken down. At one point, they were going to take it down and sell it for scrap. But the public eventually became enamored of it, and they preserved it, and it's become the icon of Paris today. And it was taller than the pyramids, and it was seen as this great marvel of the era. Things are moving and shaking over in America, too, and we're seeing a lot of architects, again, include modern materials and modern forms. One of the earliest architects to do that was Richardson. Richardson was an American architect. He's probably most famous for designing Trinity Church in Boston, this strange and bizarre eclectic church, which is a mixture of both Byzantine and Romanesque style. So you have a kind of Romanesque facade here. Looks very much like a southern Romanesque style from Aquitaine in France. But then the interior looks more Byzantine, but also has Gothic elements. I think what's interesting here is that the use of, again, structural steel and cast iron. You can see those massive cast iron bars holding the dome in place. But it was he that really began to design the idea of what does a modern building look like? How do we conceive of a modern building? As buildings got bigger and bigger because of the advance of technology, how do you organize a building? It seems kind of obvious to us now, but it wasn't then. How do you kind of structure a building? Does it have when it gets over 5 or 6 stories, what's the rules? If you have a building that's, 3 or 4 stories, there's clear rules. There's an attic zone, there's a base, there's, a middle, and it works. And so he took his inspiration from palazzos in Italy. So if you've ever seen the great famous palazzos of the Renaissance, they are built like massive blocks like this. And you can see that he gives it a kind of a base, that it has a very clear and identifiable base. And then he joins these windows up into bays, repeating bays. But notice that these are double windows. He splits those bays up into smaller bays. And then finally, those are split up into individual windows. And then he crowns it all off with a cornice. This is much larger than any of the palazzos in Florence or Italy at the time, but it follows the same idea. By giving it a base, it gives it a sense of a start, and then you have these series of bays. Bays organizing structures, you can find that kind of stuff going all the way back to Romanesque churches, which ultimately got it from the Colosseum in Rome. But it's a way of conceiving of a building, and this would give people a way forward when we start designing the first true skyscrapers. One of the other architects that I think is kind of understudied at the time is Frank Fernes. He was again one of these people that was a precursor to later styles. He designed really interesting eclectic structures that again were a mix of a variety of historical styles. He threw in Gothic, he threw in Romanesque, but he was also one of the first to use large amounts of glass and steel structures in his buildings. I love this building. This building is currently the Fine Arts Library on the Pennsylvania University of Pennsylvania campus. It started out as the main library, and now it's just the Fine Arts Library. But one of my favorite things is this thing over here is a part of the building that was actually built on rails, like railroad rails. And the entire building was movable. That this section here could actually be pulled back on rails. And then the idea was that as you needed to expand the building, you could just add another bay of steel and glass. You could just slide the whole end of the building away and just keep expanding the building forever. And it was really a brilliant idea. They never used it. It never happened. But what a fun idea. We sometimes forget that steampunk was real. When you get to the interior of it, you have these, again, bays, and the bays are made out of stone and brick. But look at the roof. The roof is entirely supported out of these large steel structures, and you can see that the span is a massive steel girder that goes from side to side. We have a walkway and little student carrels up there that are again supported on cast iron columns that are impossibly thin, but that's the beauty of cast iron and steel. It's really strong given the weight that it has. So we're seeing the introduction of modern materials. We're seeing architects work with these kind of materials, but the introduction of probably the first true modern architecture doesn't happen until a massive tragedy in Chicago, and this gives us the Chicago School. So the Chicago School is the first school of modern architecture, and it happens right here in the United States. Its pioneer is probably going to be Louis Sullivan. Louis Sullivan was one of the great architects. There were many architects in the Chicago School, and these are the people that pioneered the masonry-clad steel frame construction that is, quite frankly, the basis of most modern skyscraper construction today. These are the people that truly invented the skyscraper. What happens is that you have a massive fire. So if you know the famous old story of Miss O'Leary's cow who kicked over the lantern and started the fire, whether that story is true or not, we don't know, but a massive fire gutted the downtown area of Chicago in 1871. Absolutely leveled it. It was completely destroyed. But as big of a tragedy as this was, it was actually a huge boon to modern architecture because this meant that the city had to be rebuilt. And so how do you rebuild the city? And one of the things that's interesting is that downtown areas are very pricey in terms of real estate. Generally cities had a choice. You could grow out or that was the only real option you had before the invention of the skyscraper. The city could expand or things could get denser, but most people simply didn't have the technology to build buildings more than about 5 or 6 stories tall. And then you had to have elevators. Elevators are complicated. And a whole bunch of things came together to make this happen. One was the introduction of electricity. Electricity meant that you could effectively light these buildings. You could also effectively power elevators to get them all the way to the top. So you didn't have to walk up 6 or 7 flights. And so the skyscraper was born. And it really was this practical decision to increase the amount of real estate that you could cram into a small area. If you can't go out, you go up. And that actually makes that much more efficient. And elevators and electricity and all this modern technology made this possible. And so here you can see Adler and Sullivan creating the Wainwright Building. And they follow that basic idea that Richardson was putting down. That is, you create a base, a kind of lower story with a kind of a mezzanine that gives you a sense of a base. You have a high cornice, but most of the building is given over to a massive grid of windows. This entire thing is built on a steel frame. And again, steel was essential to this because they needed to rebuild the city quickly because it was gutted. Steel could go up quick, and a steel frame is incredibly strong. And if you clad it in masonry, it's also very fireproof. Steel by itself, exposed to fire, can weaken pretty quick. I'm a hobbyist blacksmith. I'm actually building a blacksmith shop right now. And you don't have to get steel very hot before it turns into a frickin' noodle. It just, it loses its strength the hotter it gets. It has incredible strength, but you get a fire, it loses it. But if you clad it in masonry, that protects it from heat. So these buildings really were much safer than previous buildings, and you could build them taller and safer, and you could clad the exterior in a grid of windows to allow the light to come into the interior. The other thing about the grid plan is it means the floor plans are entirely open. If you wanted to partition it off into offices, great. If you wanted to open it up and have an open floor plan where everybody could communicate, part of it could be warehouse, part of it could be ending. This was incredibly flexible. There was really no limit to how you could organize these floors. So renters loved it because every single floor could be tooled to the experience or to the needs of the renter. And it really opened up our cities. One of the more famous examples of this is the Peary and Scott building, which is now the Sullivan Center. And you can see again, it has a base that kind of establishes it. It has a kind of different top. You don't have to say that you've reached the end, but most of the building is going to be just rows and rows of glass. Most of this part of the building was added later. As far as decoration, Sullivan was the guy who pioneered the idea of form follows function. In fact, we often credit him with the invention of the term. Form follows function means that, you don't add any excess decoration that you don't need. Instead of decorating these surfaces, you leave them open so you can have as maximum window space as possible. Now, Sullivan, for his part, did like a little bit of decoration. And so he had these ornate cast iron decorations that were designed. Lovely stuff. Again, very much similar to the kind of things that were happening in the Art Nouveau over in Europe. But generally, these buildings are relatively simple, relatively straightforward, and they don't owe anything to the past. Maybe a little bit to the palazzos of Europe, but that's about it. Structurally, in terms of their decoration, they are what they are. And it was seen as very American, very earnest, very virtuous, and it was very, very popular. So Chicago became a big, powerful city. It was one of the major meat markets, one of the major trading hubs in the Midwest. It's what's known as America's second city, because New York was kind of the first city because the center of the hub. But Chicago was, fast and rising right there in the edge of the prairie and the Great Lakes. So it had all of these transportation hubs. And just like Paris or London or all the other great cities of Europe, they wanted to have a massive exposition as well to prove that they had arrived. And in 1893, they had the Chicago Colombian Exposition. And this is actually the death knell of the first school of modern art. That is, it is the death knell of the Chicago School, because the commissioners and organizers of this event completely squeezed out the new school of thought, and the Chicago School. Adler, Sullivan, all the rest of them were, basically prevented from participating. And what they presented instead was a kind of belle epic, French continental style architecture. All of this is made out of basically plaster and chicken wire over wooden and steel frames. It looks so imposing, but yeah, this was all intended to be temporary architecture. You can't see it. None of it is there today. But when we look at it, it's all classical architecture. It's all Greco-Roman or Baroque or stuff that is an emulation of Europe. America always has had a kind of inferiority complex. Even when we make something new and something wonderful like the Chicago School, we would rather, have the European stuff, because European says sophistication, etc. I get so tired of this. No offense to any European listeners. No offense, you do wonderful stuff. We can't match your cheeses and chocolate. But and lots of things that America did are really fabulous. But again, it demonstrates that holy crap, we can't allow our own style. Only one building, the Transportation Building, was done in a new style, and that was done by Louis Sullivan. Every other building there was done in a kind of neoclassical or neo-Baroque or Second Empire, done in a European style. And so the first age of modern architecture rather ignominiously comes to an end. And it probably would have ended there had it not been for Louis Sullivan's greatest apprentice, a guy by the name of Frank Lloyd Wright. So Frank Lloyd Wright became the premier architect of the early 20th century. He was an apprentice to Louis Sullivan. He accepted most of his ideas, and he was a young man when this exposition happened. And he very much was committed to the ideas of the Chicago School, but he wanted to focus on domestic architecture, on houses. Now, one of the great things about these expositions is that they also had a wide variety of world architecture. The whole point of something like this is to prove that you're cosmopolitan. And so not only do you have this enormous, gigantic center, this white city based on European architecture, but there were also sections that were based on world architecture. And so there was a street that was based on a street in Cairo. There were buildings that were copies of very famous Mayan buildings, because those were being excavated at the time and were very new and popular. But perhaps the most famous is that on the island in the center of this thing, there was a Japanese pavilion. And the Japanese pavilion was a reconstruction of the Phoenix Temple in Kyoto. And this was Japanese architecture. So young architect and student to Louis Sullivan, Frank Lloyd Wright, went into this, and it was unlike any architecture he ever saw. There was even a tea house there, and so people could actually experience what it was like to be in a Japanese tea house. Now, Japanese architecture is very different. It stresses natural materials, but the buildings are low to the ground. They're not very tall. They're not very ornate. And they have an open plan. That is, that in a traditional Japanese house, you don't have a bedroom and a living room, etc. In fact, the sleeping arrangements are hidden behind cabinets, and then you have screens to partition the room. You have things like byobu screens and other screens to partition the room when you need to. But it's a much more open plan. It's a much more kind of open and inviting space with large screens that open out onto a garden. And the quality and the details are what really matter. And so the garden, there's this mix of interior and exterior space. They have low-hipped roofs and natural materials. So this was incredibly inspirational to Frank Lloyd Wright. And so when Frank Lloyd Wright began designing his houses, he took all of this into his work. And a lot of this aligned, the simplicity of the buildings, the open plan of the buildings, already aligned with what Louis Sullivan was teaching him. So he published an article in the Ladies' Home Journal about what a house should be like on the prairie. And he was very much believing in this idea that architecture should fit its surroundings, that there is no such thing as a universal architecture. Architecture should fit into its surroundings. Well, if you know the prairie, if you know the Midwest, it's flat. It's not like Utah, where you have these beautiful rugged mountains, these high Wasatch, mountain range and with snow on them, or you have Moab with its red rocks and canyon lands and all the beautiful scenery that we have in Utah. No, the Midwest is flat. It is flat, flat, flat. And so you need an architecture that fits that openness. It's beautiful. When you get out on the prairie, it's beautiful because it just becomes this extreme minimalist environment with the open sky. It's incredible. So he designed his houses to fit that, and this became known as his prairie style. So this first got published in 1905, but very quickly people started commissioning him to build houses. And probably the best example of that is the Roby House, which is in Chicago. So when we look at this house, right off the bat, you can see that it has a low-hipped roof, very much like Japanese architecture, and broad eaves, also very much like Japanese architecture. It doesn't have a lot of exterior decoration. It counts on its masses and its form to make the decoration. When you get to the inside, you have these broad, open interiors. His decoration is in the form of wooden decoration, which emphasizes the qualities of the house. There's really no separation between the living space of the house and the kitchen. It's all one open space. So all of these houses, whether it's a ranch-style home or a McMansion today that have these great rooms that the kitchen and everything else flows into one space, you can owe all of that to Frank Lloyd Wright. And Frank Lloyd Wright took that inspiration from Japanese houses, but made it American. It's kind of funny. I lived in every house, this is the youngest house I've ever lived in, and it was made in 1935. I've lived in 3 fixer-uppers. And let me tell you, nothing will kill you on fixer-uppers than having to do 3 of them in a row. But the oldest house we lived in was probably made around 1890. And it was an old-style Pennsylvania farmhouse. We lived in Pennsylvania at the time. And it had a dining room, it had a parlor, and it had a kitchen. And these were all separate rooms. They had doors between them. Some of the doors had been removed, but they had sliding doors and other things that were between them that, they were meant to be separate places. And so the idea of just making these open great rooms, that was a real revolutionary idea in the beginning of the 20th century. And all of the architecture, all of the furniture was integrated. He was the designer. He designed these really beautiful but extremely uncomfortable chairs. Frank Lloyd Wright was something of an egomaniac. He would design all the furniture in all of his houses, and even when he was an old man, he kept keys to all of the houses that he made. And people would come home, and they would come home, and all the furniture had been moved around. There would be a note on the door saying, "Hey, Frank Lloyd Wright, I came by, and all your furniture was in the wrong place, so I reorganized." So if you had Frank Lloyd Wright design a house, you pretty much were married to the guy for as long as he was alive. And a lot of the furniture was not very comfortable furniture, but it was meant to be this unified design. Even as you look to the front, it's got a strange aspect to it. This is the street front, but as you walk around it, there's really no front door. He didn't want it to have a front door. He wanted it to kind of be equal to the exterior. So you actually have to walk around the front of this place and come around to the back side till you find the door. He wanted to maximize privacy and to make it a kind of an intimate place. It's really an interesting building. Well, it had a profound effect on architecture and cemented his career, and he became one of the first great celebrity architects in the United States. And then he suffered a series of tragedies. One of the servants at his house in Wisconsin, Taliesin East, went nuts and stabbed several people in his house, and he lost a child in a fire that was started because of that, if I recall correctly. He also suffered a terrible scandal because he cheated on his wife, and that caused a scandal. That was a serious thing in America back then. And his career kind of imploded during the 1920s. So after the war period, he was this very famous early 20th century architect, but after that his career kind of imploded, and he did a few houses in LA based on a Mayan style, but he otherwise drifted off the map. But elsewhere in Europe, people were still kind of experimenting with these new ideas and new techniques. So you have Behrens, who starts making this factory. Again, his idea was to take the scale and the proportions and the forms of classical architecture, but render it out into the new materials. So we have what looks like a columned facade, but instead of columns, they are concrete or steel piers. It has a pediment, almost like a classical building, but again, this is all supported by pre-structured, steel trusses and frames. Elsewhere in Europe, following the war, we have a development of more geometric styles. So, for example, we have this movement of Dutch artists, de stijl, meaning the style. And it was a reaction to some of the excesses of architecture that had been produced. They wanted something, again, that was simple, concrete. Theo van Doesburg said, "We speak of concrete and not abstract painting because nothing is more concrete, more real than a line, a color, a surface." And so he would make these kind of paintings. This is the cow. And I know what you're thinking. What? How is this a cow? Well, you have to see his sketches. He started with the actual sketch of the cow, and by degrees he deconstructs it until it eventually becomes nothing but pure shape. The person who really took this idea to the extreme and moved it towards geometric abstraction was Mondrian. Piet Mondrian was creating these pure compositions using only primary colors in white and black. And he stayed with this style through his life. But the thing that this really impacts is design. And so we start to see an extraordinarily reduced design. Gerrit Rietveld designs this chair, and he builds it all out of nominal pieces of lumber. What I mean is, he didn't carve or create the lumber himself. He took existing stuff that you could get and cut it to length and then fitted it together so that it was as true to the original dimensions of the lumber. And then, of course, he creates this and then augments it with bright, vibrant primary colors. You can especially see this in this house that he designs. This is the Rietveld Schroeder house, and this is in Utrecht, designed 1924 after the war. I love comparing it to the houses next to it. So you have more traditional row homes, and here you can see nothing exists that isn't geometric. Everything here is essential. You have windows that come together at the corners, so you have these unobstructed panoramas that look over the entire street, but then everything inside is joined. There's nothing that's excessive. Ultimately, these ideas of modernism come together at the Bauhaus. So the Bauhaus is a movement started and founded by Walter Gropius. Walter Gropius is a German architect, and he was the director of Bauhaus. Bauhaus had a couple different meanings. It could be described as the art of building, or the house of building. And it starts in Weimar, Germany, which was the foundation of the new republic following World War I. But he quickly moves it to Dessau, Germany, and then eventually at the end it moves to Berlin. Gropius is something of a radical. He himself believed in design that exemplified Louis Sullivan's principles of form follows function, that there should be nothing extraneous to a building's design. He rejects all ornament. So for him, the solution is not to come up with a new ornament like Art Nouveau or Art Deco or all these other new styles. It is to remove all ornament, to have the honesty of the materials. And at this school, he assembles really an exceptional group of individuals. Some really amazing thinker, particularly I'm going to point out Joseph Albers, but also Marcel Breuer, Vasily Kandinsky, Paul Klee, a whole collection of European thinkers and artists that were committed to this new style, this new revolution in taste. And they create a system of teaching that is different than what anyone else had ever done before. They really believed in a holistic view of design. That is, that the designer should impact every aspect of life. Everything in your life shouldn't just be left to chance. Everything should be unified in its design. Everything should work harmoniously together. And a student should be just as able with steel and concrete as he is with textiles or fabric or paint. And so they had this system, and you can see they've diagrammed it out, how you were supposed to work that way. And so people like Kandinsky flees Germany during the war to his native Russia, but he returns and he brings this kind of understanding to this plan. And you can see he develops these simple color harmonies and exercises. Albers was very famous in exercising how is the color. So this was almost a scientific, a clinical attempt to understand the fundamental principles of design. And it has an enormous impact on everything in our lives today, from typography to graphic design to furniture design. The place that this all comes together is Dessau, Germany. So he was working in Weimar, Germany, and he wanted a place where his students and his professors could work together. And so he chose Dessau, Germany, because he could get a location outside of the city that was free from building codes, so he could build a building the way he wanted to. And he wanted an integrated building where all of the student studio spaces and the cafeteria were all together in one building. And this is the building that he built. There was a bridge that kind of connected the structure together. All the various different parts of the building were meant to unify together. In fact, students who were there said that it was kind of like a self-contained city. Now, if you go to UVU and you go on campus, for those of you who are still going on campus in the middle of this pandemic, everything on UVU campus is connected together. There is a causeway or a thoroughfare that joins every single building to another building. It's fantastic during the Utah winters because you can walk from one class to the other and never go outdoors. But that unified building, that idea of a kind of a campus that is its own kind of self-contained city, well, that's Bauhaus for you. That was the idea, that everything that you needed could be right there. Only the faculty houses were on a separate piece of property. Everything else was right there, and it was meant to make things completely accessible. The whole design was really not meant to be understood except from the air. That's what Gropius said, is that, it really was supposed to be integrated in that way. The main hall has this incredible innovation that he realized that you could clad an entire building in glass, that if you put an overhang onto the building, then the glass doesn't need to be supporting. It can hang almost like a curtain wall. And so you have an entire wall of glass around the exterior of this building. Now, this was before they had modern heating and cooling to actually make this work. So this was like putting the whole thing inside a greenhouse, and people complained that it got ridiculously hot in the summer and, of course, cold in the winter, so they actually had to put blinds in here. But it was even designed so that the sun would wake the students up naturally, that he wanted the building to interact with the natural rhythms, and so it would bring natural light into the building. The two halves of the building are joined by a bridge, and we know that in this case he was actually influenced by Cubist art, that Cubist art was about breaking things into kind of fractal shapes, and that's the way he wanted the building broken up. But he wanted the bridge to also serve a purpose. He wanted it to join the kind of living areas with the working areas, and the offices of the staff are in this bridge, so that you enter into the complex and you cross from one side to the other. The faculty are literally kind of at the center of your movement as you go by. Here you can see that incredible curtain wall. And it wasn't just the offices and the designs of the building. Every aspect of every part of the building was designed to fit in. It had this holistic concept. The furnishings, the rugs, the wall hangings, the light fixtures, even a chess set, were all designed, and students and faculty worked together to produce these. Instead of putting a piece of art on the wall, he wanted it to be something that was functional, and he would let the radiator stand in the same place that maybe a painting would hang. And the radiator would be designed so well that it would be honest. All of these materials were, again, supposed to be straightforward, honest. All design was not to, hide the material or, take the wood and carve it into some ornate figure, but to let the material speak for itself and to be true to itself. It really was an remarkable place because he managed to kind of build it in a mass-produced way. The whole building went up in less than a year, and while this was before modern air and cooling, it had lots of problems, and many of the artists and residents had to paint over the walls for the sake of privacy. It had to paint over the glass walls to preserve privacy or just to keep themselves from baking. It really was this kind of extraordinary place. Some of the things that get designed and come out of it are still around with us today. This is one of Marcel Breuer's designs, this essential chair that is nothing more than steel tubing and then leather. And yet, this is a very comfortable chair. It gives you the whole sense of the thing. Some of the chairs that, even the chairs in the auditoriums and the desks, were there designed at the same time. Oh my gosh. In high schools and institutions all around the world, these tubing style chairs are still being made. So, and I want to point out, this is very early. This is 1920s. It was founded in 1919 and went to about 1933, 1934. And between 1920 and I can't remember, 1933, I think it was in Dessau, Germany, in this location. It eventually moved back to Berlin. But everything from our typefaces, our furnishings, were impacted by these group of individuals. Alas, it came down to an end. 1932, 1933, it's closed down by the rise of the Nazi Party. All of these kind of radical ideas coming out of these very modernist ideas, these were seen as subversive by the Nazi Party. The Nazi Party comes to power in the early 1930s, and they shut almost all of these modern or avant-garde art movements down. And this is part of the reason that Bauhaus became so influential in a way, that Walter Gropius ultimately has to leave and winds up being this exile in America. And he goes on to take a position at Harvard, where he works as a professor of architecture. But Bauhaus basically came to an end. But what's interesting is that at the same time, international architecture, the international style of architecture pioneered by Bauhaus, really begins to take off. And this is where we enter into what we call the period known as the international style. An exhibition of art was held in 1932 at the Museum of Modern Art. And what they really wanted to do is they wanted to show all of the innovations that were coming out of Europe, out of this time. America, which had been the birthplace of modern architecture, really under the Chicago School, had gone back into a revivalist mode and was basically doing, traditional revivalist architecture. It wasn't terribly interesting. And so the Museum of Modern Art wanted to bring attention to all these innovations that were happening in Europe. And they put together an exhibition, and they called this exhibition the International Style. And that's actually a very good title, because one of the things that defines this style is its universality. That the creators of this new modern style and design and architecture really wanted architecture to be separated from national or ethnic origin. You can understand why the Nazis hated it then, because they were all about ethnic and national identity. But they wanted a style that was universal, that could be dropped in anywhere. And again, they really believed in this ideal of form follows function, and they also believed in this concept that houses should be machines for living. This was Corbusier's great contribution to this. And so they put together this exhibition of all of these innovations that were happening. One of the major innovations that was happening was an entire complex of new and modern housing that was in Stuttgart. These are the Wiesenhof estates. And the Wiesenhof estates were built as an expression of these ideals. Started in 1927, but continued onward. And you can see how radically different it is, because in the background, we have kind of traditional, German-style row homes and larger homes. They have steeply pitched roofs. They're made out of stone. And this little cul-de-sac here were all these modern houses. And you have several architects, Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, Oud, a whole bunch of architects, and they each design an independent set of houses or buildings. You'll notice that they all have flat roofs. They all have, geometric forms. They're quite a departure from it. Now, here's where you really can criticize a lot of modern artists and architects. One of the things about modernism is that they always argued that this was natural, that we were letting these materials be themselves. We are doing things that are functional, utilitarian. The form follows function. This part of Germany gets, 30 inches of rain a year. You can't build a flat-roofed building in a place that gets 30 inches of rain a year and say form follows function. I'm sorry. That's the opposite of functional. It's, in fact, a very big problem. And in fact, a lot of these buildings did have these problems. They weren't exactly honest with themselves, and they weren't exactly honest with the world. They asserted that what they were doing was purely functional, utilitarian. They were stripping out the old ornament and creating something that was pure. But I'm sorry, when you give people flat roofs in rainy climates, what you're really doing is you're pushing an ideology. And the ideology was one of simplicity of form and idea over tradition. They really wanted something that was against all tradition. And I actually like a lot of modernist architecture and modernist design, but this kind of arrogance to it really kind of puts me off. Eventually these buildings would find, these styles of buildings would find homes in places like Palm Springs, California, and the American Southwest, where they're very low rain, and they're nice warm climates. They fit in a lot better, and of course we invented central air and air conditioning, and so they were a lot more suited to those environments. But at the time they were created, they really weren't purely functional. This is really ideological. But still, they're amazing structures. Here's a series of row homes, and each row home here has a self-contained kind of courtyard, and then a series of windows that would allow you to look into your own courtyard, but not the courtyard of your neighbor. So, and the ribbon windows are high enough up that it maximizes, light coming in, but also maintains privacy. So there's a lot of great ideas here. The architect who really brings this to the fore, this idea of the international style, is going to be Mies van der Rohe. Mies van der Rohe was a German architecture, and when Gropius gave up on Bauhaus and left it, he becomes the last director of Bauhaus in Berlin before eventually the Nazis shut that down too. And he's often regarded as the father of the international style. And he loved this extreme simplicity of form. He's the first person to suggest making a skyscraper out of pure glass and steel superstructure. This was one of his designs and models, but it was never built. But in 1929, he's asked to build a pavilion in Barcelona. Again, it was another one of these world expositions, a place for Spain to show off and the city of Barcelona to show off its sophistication. And so Germany was going to design a pavilion. Why not? And they chose him to design this, and it's unlike anything anybody's ever seen. First of all, it's again very long and low and flat. It is a very strange pavilion. It has a large reflecting pool, and it's supported entirely by just 4 columns. This red outline is the overhang of the roof. And it has an entirely open plan. This is the main entrance. This goes back to an area, but there's a fountain back there. And you can see some areas are covered, but open to the exterior. Even when you get to the interior, it has this incredibly open plan and a door that goes back to a kind of open area, a pond with a statue there. The walls and the surfaces, there's no baseboards, there's no cornices, there's no ornate columns or capitals. The steel column is simply clad in aluminum, and it's an entirely open space. I really like modernist buildings, at least in warm climates, because it brings the exterior into the interior. You can walk out to your deck or your pool. It's really remarkable. You have these walls of glass, and none of the walls are structural. The structure is entirely on these simple steel columns. Really kind of amazing stuff. These chairs that he designed are called Barcelona Chairs. They were designed for the pavilion, and their simplicity themselves. They have this cast aluminum frame, which is very strong, and then 2 cushions. And these are still being made. They're still being licensed, made. The HVAC Center at BYU is also very modernist originally in its initial phase, and it had some genuine Barcelona chairs made by the authorized company for it when it was created. But when they updated it back in the 90s, the Barcelona chairs were kind of worn out, and so they were just going to dump them and scrap them. And several of the designers at BYU are like, no! And so they squirreled them away into their offices and basically stole them and kept them and didn't tell anybody that they had squirreled them away because they were such this incredible design. But beautiful, elegant, simple. The other architect that kind of defines the international style is going to be Corbusier. Corbusier is a Swiss-French architect and urban planner. And he was the one that came up with this idea of that, houses are machines for living. He says space and light and order, those are the things that men need just as much as they need bread or a place to sleep. And so some of his earliest designs were experimenting with this. Again, these are just simple slabs of concrete separated by steel columns. The house that he brought all of this together is going to be the Villa Savoye, which is in France. And this house is such a strange house. Again, this is 1928. This is really avant-garde for the time. Again, it has ribbon windows. It almost looks like the superstructure or the bridge of a ship. And in fact, much of the inspiration comes from ship architecture because ships are gigantic machines, steamships. This looks like the bridge of the Titanic or something. The lower half is the garage. And you would actually come into the lower half. And so the lower half actually kind of acts like a massive carport or porch. And then you would go into the interior and you would have your choice of either staircase or ramp, which is again very much like a boat with steel railings. And then you would come up to the upper level. And the upper level was again a way of maximizing this interior and exterior space and maximizing light, but also maximizing privacy, because these spaces would have these huge glass windows that would look out onto this interior courtyard. Now, this is a computer animation because I couldn't find a better photo, but these massive spaces only had ribbon windows out to the front. Let me go back and show those to you. So you had ribbon windows, but those ribbon windows were high enough up that you really couldn't peek into a person's house through those ribbon windows. They would have let light come in. But then when you get to the interior, you have these massive courtyard that would let light in. So these became very light and open-filled spaces. And then one of the advantages of having a flat roof is it doesn't just become wasted space. It actually have a ramp that goes up there, and then you had a steel enclosure that would provide privacy, but you have an upper deck there that you yourself could actually enjoy. So these were really amazing innovations. And all of these are what brought them to the attention of the Museum of Modern Art and caused them to have this show in 1931-32 that they framed and called it the International Style. Now, they also wanted to invite Frank Lloyd Wright, and they wanted to invite Frank Lloyd Wright because he was a very prominent American architect, and quite frankly, he was doing very, very similar things to the International Style. He was just doing them 20 years earlier than they were doing them. And Frank Lloyd Wright declined, and then you have this spat that develops between him and Walter Gropius. Walter Gropius is asked what he thinks of Frank Lloyd Wright, and he says that Frank Lloyd Wright was the greatest architect of the 19th century. Now that's a very, very subtle slam, but it's one of the best pieces of shade that's ever been thrown. What he was saying by that is, yeah, he may have been good, but he is past his prime. He is done. He has no new ideas. We're the future. He's the past. What an insult. So Frank Lloyd Wright basically just said, oh, hell no. Oh, no, we're not going to put up with this. And Frank Lloyd Wright commissioned a series of drawings, a portfolio, and he sent this out. And what he basically did is he said, okay, all of you schmucks took most of these ideas from me anyway. I'll show you how it's really supposed to be done. And this portfolio went out, and it was very, very successful. Remember that Frank Lloyd Wright is kind of in a low part in his career at this point. This portfolio creates enough attention that he actually comes to the attention of some pretty big clients. And this is where we enter into kind of the third phase of Frank Lloyd Wright's career, which really cements his reputation. He sends out these drawings of various buildings, and this attracts the attention of Edgar J. Kaufman, Sr. Edgar J. Kaufman was a very wealthy man who had made his money in a series of department stores, and he was centered in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He had a property out in Pennsylvania known as Bear Run, and near Bear Run, Pennsylvania, was the local site. And on that property there was a waterfall. And what he wanted is he wanted a cottage out there, a place that he could retreat to when he needed to get away from the city. And so he commissioned Frank Lloyd Wright to create a cottage, a vacation cottage, a small little 1 or 2 bedroom house that had views of the waterfall. And Frank Lloyd Wright said, sure. And then he gave him this, which is probably Frank Lloyd Wright's masterpiece, and as you can tell, is far from a dinky little cottage with a view of the waterfall. He actually decides, as he builds the site, that, the waterfall is the thing that really attracts your attention. Instead of building a house to view the waterfall, he will integrate the house into the waterfall itself. So he builds this enormous series of cantilevered concrete forms that actually float over the surface of the waterfall. And the forms project out, and like the limestone rocks, they just kind of repeat the form. He uses natural materials from the site. That was one of his big things. And he builds these enormous cantilevered forms, which are essentially mimicking the location. It fits to the location. And he even builds a staircase, and the staircase comes down off of one of these huge cantilevered sections, and this staircase doesn't actually touch the water. It's floating above the surface of the water. But you could come down and sit down and dangle your feet in the water. And he builds it in and around the trees. He even will move some of the trusses to go around the trees. And Frank Lloyd Wright was very critical of the international style because ultimately they were more emphasized on their machine-like aesthetic and their modern materials. And they didn't, well, they had values. They mixed the indoors and the outdoors. They felt unnatural. They kind of lost a sense of the human scale. They became just big volumes in boxy shapes. And he wanted, and they also lost their context with nature and with the landscape around. And so Frank Lloyd Wright really wanted to emphasize that by bringing in natural materials. This hearth here is the actual bedrock. So the hearth of the fireplace here is built out of the actual bedrock itself. All of these windows open up and are framed by rock that's taken from the site. And as you can see, he took great care to preserve the nature and the site as much as possible. It's really an amazing piece. And it re-cements his reputation as probably the greatest living architect of his age. So don't throw shade at Frank Lloyd Wright. He'll make you eat every word. And it basically ticked off a whole nother career for Frank Lloyd Wright. And he gets a series of big commissions after this. Commissions not just for houses, but for major sections and major buildings. He gets approached by the family for the Johnson Wax Company. They need to build a new headquarters, and so they enlist him to design it. So he designs a tower, and he makes the tower, again, out of glass. But what's interesting is that each story is actually 2 stories, and there's an interior balcony. So you get this sense of air and space that comes together. The building looks like a series of sandstone bluffs. You have this bridge that joins the 2 halves of the building together. But of course, what really people remark on is the engineering of these huge mushroom or lily pad-like shapes. These were concrete piers that Frank Lloyd Wright himself designed, and many people doubted that they had the strength to hold up the roof, but he went and did a test where he piled them up with sandbags, and it held far more weight than was needed by the design, and eventually they had to get a wrecking ball to knock it down. Here he is staging this kind of publicity event showing how strong these were. And so he fills the entire open space of the building with these forms. And then in between, he has glass tubing. He couldn't find the glass that would create the kind of diffuse light that he needed, so he actually had glaziers, basically weld glass tubes together to give this kind of diffuse light. It leaked terribly. It's since had to be replaced with something that's similar. All of these architects often push their materials to the limit. A lot of these modern buildings tended to leak or were drafty or had problems with heating. But again, you're experimenting with forms. But this beautiful interior space is just never really been equaled. No one really knows how to call this. The inspiration of this is it's something like a forest. People have called it like mushrooms. Other people have described it. It's like being at the bottom of a pond of lily pads. It's really quite incredible. It suffuses the area with air and light, etc. But ultimately, it's the international style that comes afore, and it comes afore largely because of the works of Gropius and others. Philip Johnson, the American architect and architectural critic, ultimately embraces this and creates, after the war, what has to be the most austere, manifestation of the international style. I mean, the thing looks like a terrarium, for criminy's sake. This is the Philip Johnson house in Canaan, Connecticut, and here you can see that it's just a glass box. It has a flat roof, but the interior has this unimpeded space. Now, if you have the property for this, this can be quite cool because you see out to the exterior. There's almost no break between you and the exterior, but it can be a little bit exposing. Mies van der Rohe, for his part, also comes into his full when America in the post-war period has this massive boom, and he brings his ideas and this incredible kind of Spartan ideals to the skyscraper. So here, the realization of an idea that he had all the way back in 1922 finally becomes reality in 1958, when he has a building that is just pure glass and steel. Now, as you look at this building, it just becomes an almost simple, minimalistic form. The rule in New York at the time was setbacks. As these buildings started to get taller and taller, people realized this was shutting light out from the street. And so to combat that, the rule was that for every so many stories you went up, you had to push the stories back. So that's why you have this stepped form here. He decides not to do that. Instead of creating a step in this building, which would have just broken the aesthetic, he creates a single monolith of a building, and he steps it back by creating a vast open plaza. So this thing almost becomes a kind of minimalist sculpture with a huge, vast plaza, and then a series of massive columns that support the interior. At the center, as you go into this, you just have this open, vast space, no decoration, simple interiors. The interiors are covered with just plain travertine or polished concrete, and the only thing on the bottom story is a kind of core of elevators to bring you all the way to the top. So the international style in the post-war period becomes the kind of official style for modern architecture going forward. It's amazing, many of the ideas of the Bauhaus go all the way back to the 1920s, but it's the mid-century, the 1950s and 60s, that fully embrace that aesthetic. In fact, that's why we call it mid-century modern in design and architecture, because that's the era where these ideas ultimately have their germination. But you can already see that people are beginning to have second thoughts, and even some of the great designers of modernism begin to become more experimental. For his part, Frank Lloyd Wright, one of his last major commissions is the Guggenheim Museum again in New York. And as you can see, this doesn't look dominated by simple angular forms and horizontal spaces. Instead, it's dominated by this incredible spiral form. The entire Guggenheim is one continuous ramp spiraled up in this building. And it kind of is an interesting space. The idea was it would be like a continuous gallery. You could start at the top and walk your way all the way down, or at the bottom and walk your way up, and have no breaks in the gallery. The truth is, the tilted floor, it kind of makes it difficult to actually look at the works of art. I think it's a success as a building, but kind of a failure as a museum in that regard. But even Corbusier was experimenting with forms, going to more organic and sweeping forms, and he started after the war, creating these organic forms with these sweeping porches. This was a pilgrimage church, and as such it has an exterior altar, and so he covered it in this sweeping concrete kind of porch. The entrance here opens up to an interior that has a variety of stained glass windows, creating a kind of mystical interior. You can see that entire roof looks like it's floating. There's a string of very thin windows, and then all these other deep set windows that create a kind of mystery. How on earth could you ever say this is form follows function? This is form for the sake of form. And so architecture goes back to being experimental, and we quickly kind of move out of modern architecture and into postmodern architecture. But we'll save that conversation for another time. Okay, well, that one went a little long, but thanks. I know that's a lot of material. We'll start up next time with what's happening in painting and art immediately after World War I. And boy, is it a complicated era. And then we'll move into surrealism and what's happening in America in the preparation for abstract expressionism, which is the kind of, honestly, counterpoint to all of this high modernism that existed in the 1950s. But this inspirationally really comes from what was happening in the International School and in Bauhaus in the 1920s. Okay, thanks so much. We'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.